So... There's a guitar riff that sounds like it's being played backwards through a broken machine. It opens up an album that was released 2 weeks after Nevermind and a few months after 10. 2 records that would go on to define an entire generation. The album in question sold over 1.5 million copies, earned a Grammy nomination, and launched one of rock's most ferocious touring runs of the decade. And somehow, almost nobody talks about it. That album is Badmotorfinger by Soundgarden. It was released on October 8th, 1991, and if you haven't listened to it from front to back, I highly recommend you give it a listen after this video. To understand what Badmotorfinger is, you need to first understand what Soundgarden was in 1991. They actually weren't a new band. They had been grinding out of Seattle since 1984 and releasing EPs, an indie debut called Ultra Mega OK, and a major label record called Louder Than Love in 1989. By the time they walked into the studio in the spring of 1991, they had already paid their dues twice over. After that, something was starting to shift. The original bassist Hiro Yamamoto had quit after Louder Than Love. They briefly cycled through another bassist and then settled on Ben Shepherd, a young, wilder player who Kim Thayil would later say made the music faster and weirder. That energy is all over Badmotorfinger, which is why I think it makes it so great. But there was another major contributor to the album, and it was grief. Chris Cornell had just lost his close friend and former roommate Andrew Wood, who was the frontman of Mother Love Bone, to a heroin overdose in March of 1990. That loss drove Cornell into one of the most creative periods of his life. He co-wrote and recorded Temple of the Dog, which served as a kind of tribute record to Wood. Between the recording sessions and the release of Badmotorfinger itself, the heartbreak was real, and it shows up in the music. Not always, obviously, but underneath everything, there's a weight to this. This album just feels personal. What came out of those sessions was not a grunge album in the way that most people think of grunge. It wasn't a Nevermind. It wasn't a 10, but it was heavier, stranger, more metal, more psychedelic, more indebted to Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin than to the punk rock influences circulating through the rest of the Seattle scene. Chris Cornell himself put it plainly in a 1991 interview with the LA Times. "I don't think a band should compromise themselves for anything. Not for an audience, not for a record label. The feeling that you're true to yourself translates almost every time to your audience." And Soundgarden was true to themselves. Badmotorfinger is the proof. Let's talk about what makes this album sonically unlike almost anything else from its era. Kim Thayil is one of the most underappreciated guitarists of the 1990s. While other grunge guitarists were working in standard or drop D tuning, Thayil was building his own system. Alternate tunings, unconventional chord voicings, and a relationship with dissonance that felt almost academic. On Badmotorfinger, he took things even further. Take Rusty Cage, for example, the album's opener. Thayil later described the tuning as pretty nutty. The guitar is run through a wah pedal kept in the low position, used not as an effect in the traditional sense, but as an audio filter, a technique Cornell himself invented for the song. Thayil said the result was, if you heard the original demos, the riff almost sounded like it was playing backwards. Not an accident. That's intention. Next up, we have Matt Cameron on the drums. Cameron is one of those drummers who sounds completely different depending on the song. He can lock into a thunderous metal groove, shift into jazz-influenced syncopation, or hold down an oddly metered pattern without even breaking a sweat. Song structures on Badmotorfinger are full of unusual time signatures, and Cameron navigates all of it while somehow making it feel natural. Quite honestly, he's the anchor holding together some genuinely weird music. Last but not least is the main man himself, Chris Cornell. His voice on this album is something that doesn't quite make sense in human terms. He had an enormous range. Apparently he had close to 4 octaves, and unlike most rock singers of the era who either screamed or crooned per se, Cornell did both, sometimes within the same song, sometimes within the same line. On Badmotorfinger specifically, he's operating at maximum intensity. There's a rawness here that even his later work doesn't fully capture. Producer Terry Date, who had also worked on Louder Than Love, gave the record a dense, crushing sound. Guitars compressed and heavy, drums punchy and forward in the mix, and Cornell's voice riding right at the surface. It's a record that sounds physical. You feel it before you even understand it. Now let's get into the key tracks of the album. 4 songs in particular that really define what Badmotorfinger is. As previously mentioned, Rusty Cage opens the album and immediately tells you what you're in for. Cornell wrote the lyrics while staring at a tour bus window somewhere in Europe. Feeling trapped, the song is about confinement and the need to escape, and the music sounds exactly like that. Coiled, explosive, the riff snapping like a spring under tension. It became a live staple for years. And then in 1996, Johnny Cash covered it for his album Unchained, produced by Rick Rubin. Cash's version won a Grammy for the Best Country Album. The image of Johnny Cash, the man in black, finding something elemental in a Soundgarden song says everything about the reach of Cornell's songwriting. The next one is actually my favorite track off the album, and it's Outshined. It's the closest thing the album has to a conventional rock song, and even then it's still pretty strange. It became their most played radio single from the record and holds up as one of the best things they've ever recorded. The lyrics, "I'm looking California and feeling Minnesota," is one of the funniest lines in a rock song, and might be one of the best throwaway lines in 90s rock. Another interesting track is Jesus Christ Pose, and was actually the lead single, and it caused a genuine cultural moment. The song itself is not anti-religious. Cornell explained in a 1992 interview with A Spin that it was about celebrities who adopt the imagery of crucifixion to imply they're persecuted or divine. He was irritated by it. The music video, however, which featured crosses, a woman crucified in place of Christ, and burning religious imagery, was way too much for MTV at the time. They banned it. The band received death threats in the UK. Religious rights groups protested outside MTV's offices, and yet none of that chaos was the point Cornell was making. He specifically said, "It's not that I would ever be offended by what someone would do with that symbol." The irony of a song criticizing people who exploit religious imagery getting banned because of religious imagery was apparently lost on almost everyone. One of the lesser-known songs on the album, Slaves and Bulldozers, is the deep cut that really separates casual listeners from true believers. Running nearly 7 minutes, it's slow, heavy, and genuinely unsettling. Doom metal before that was really a category people used. Cornell's vocal performance on this track is almost operatic. He builds from a low simmer to something that sounds like a man coming apart. It's not the song that made them famous, but it might be the song that shows you who they really were. Now, I just want to talk about the harsh reality of when this album was released. Badmotorfinger released on October 8th, 1991. Nevermind, which was one of the biggest rock albums of all time, had come out just 2 weeks earlier. 10 by Pearl Jam arrived in August. Dirt by Alice in Chains would come in 1992. 1991 was the year grunge detonated into the mainstream, and Soundgarden, the band that had really been there the longest, and debatably the one that had the most raw talent, pretty much were swallowed by the wave they helped create. Commercially, Badmotorfinger was their biggest record to that point. It eventually went double platinum, but in the context of what Nevermind did, which reshaped the entire music industry overnight, it did feel kind of modest. And then in 1994, Soundgarden themselves released Super Unknown, which debuted at number 1 at the Billboard 200 and gave them Black Hole Sun, Spoonman, and Fell on Black Days. Suddenly, Badmotorfinger became the thing that came before their own masterpiece, rather than a masterpiece in its own right. Even their guitarist, Kim Thayil, admitted that he had complicated feelings about the album for years. He told Rolling Stone in 2016 that when he finally revisited it, something changed. "I sincerely started falling in love with the album. For years, my favorite Soundgarden albums were Super Unknown and Screaming Life, and this jumped ahead of them. The problem is that Super Unknown is more digestible. It's longer and stranger, but it has more conventional melodic hooks. Black Hole Sun has a music video that played into heavy rotation. It was easier to sell. Badmotorfinger is spikier, more angular, less willing to meet you halfway. That's also why in my opinion, it makes it more interesting. But sadly, not all good things can really last forever. Chris Cornell did pass away on May 18th in 2017 in Detroit. He was just 52 years old. The world spent days trying to process what it had lost, a voice like no other. A songwriter of genuine depth and ambition, and a man who had never seemed to fully let anyone in. In the wake of his death, the conversation naturally turned to Super Unknown and Black Hole Sun, and Audioslave and the hits. That's always how it works. The well-known things get revisited first. What I'm getting at here that if you want to really understand Chris Cornell as an artist, and if you want to hear him before the world had figured out who he was, before the Polished and the Arena tours and the Bond themed, you go back to Badmotorfinger. You hear that opening riff on Rusty Cage that sounds almost backwards. You hear him on Slaves and Bulldozers, pushing his voice somewhere genuinely uncomfortable. You hear a band playing with absolute conviction and zero compromise. Kim Thayil said that Badmotorfinger is the Soundgarden record where they sound most like themselves. The record that only they could have made. And I think that's right. I think that's exactly why it got outshined, to borrow a word from the album itself. It's one of the records that sounded kind of like someone else was always going to be easier to market. The records that sound like no one else are the ones that last. Badmotorfinger lasts. It just took us a little while to notice. I'll see you guys later.